Do you worry that a lot of the work that was done after 9/11 is coming undone?
I worry that a lot of it's been set aside by the Obama administration. And now, 15 years later, it's become fashionable in some circles, including sometimes on the Hill with some of my own Republican friends, that we've forgotten or choose to set aside the events of 9/11. When you have 19 guys armed with airline tickets and box cutters come to the United States, hijack aircraft, kill 3,000 of our people, take down the World Trade Center, blow a hole in the Pentagon, would have taken out probably the White House or the Capitol building if it hadn't been for the passengers on United 93. That's a history-altering event. It's an act of war. It's worse than Pearl Harbor. And yet here we are 15 years later, and people are sort of thinking, well, that was a one-off affair, or we can afford to get rid of the database we'd built with the terror surveillance program, turn it all over to the companies, and ease off on the policies we put in place that I believe prevented further attacks. And it's unfortunate. It's as though we're going to have to get to the point where we have another attack before everybody's ready to really buckle down again and do those things that are necessary to keep us safe.
So one of the things that was said at the end of the Bush administration was the policies that you put in place are succeeding, and the evidence of that is there hasn't been another attack.
Right.
And there hasn't been certainly another. There have been attempts in the
Right.
United States. There have also been some lone wolf or self-starter terrorist attacks, but there hasn't actually been an attack. Is that a testimony to the capabilities of the intelligence community? A testimony to the incapabilities of the terrorist group? How do you see that? Because I think that might be what President Obama would say. What's your evidence?
Yeah. Well, we had reporting, for example, right after 9/11, that al-Qaeda was seeking a nuclear device in Pakistan, where they have nuclear devices. We had to be concerned from the very beginning about those kinds of things. And we had reporting about attacks that never came off. Attack on the highest building on the west coast of the United States, attack on in downtown London. So it's clear that what we did, the terror surveillance program and so forth, did put in place the necessary steps. The fact of that we didn't get hit again, I really think has a lot to do with the vigilance, with the airline security measures we put in place. We had attacks fail, such as the underwear bomber over Detroit. So there's no doubt in my mind, but what it was a positive, successful policy. And so the notion that Barack Obama brought to office was that, first of all, that we'd overstepped the bounds. Remember when he went to Cairo? And he apologized to the Muslim world for our overreaction to 9/11. One thing that I found out later was that if you look at some of the documents that were released when Snowden stole documents that we uncovered when Liz and I were doing our latest book, was that our ambassador to Japan had sent a cable back to the White House during that first year when Obama was doing his apology tour, saying the Japanese had rejected his request that he be allowed to go to Hiroshima and apologize for our having dropped the bomb on Hiroshima in World War II. So he set a tone out there that, and a set of policies, including what he's done to defense, that has persuaded a lot of our friends and allies around the world that they can no longer count on the United States. That we are not, that we don't have their back. And I think it shows, in terms of the relationships we have with so many of those folks, that the United States is no longer looked to as the go-to people to deal with the terrorist problem.
Let me ask you about the Middle East. It is not the place it was in 2008 when you and President Bush left office. There are conflicts from Yemen to Syria to Lebanon to Iraq to Libya, throughout North Africa. Al-Qaeda is really back, and many suggest it's as strong as it was on September 10th, 2001. What do you see as the root of those conflicts? Do you think the United States bears any responsibility for that?
I don't. I think some people have suggested our actions, in effect, promoted or generated 9/11. That's hogwash. We were not doing anything that merited that attack. It was the terrorists themselves who decided they wanted to hit the United States. The Mideast has been a place for conflict for a long time. I mean, when I was Secretary of Defense, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and we had to do Desert Storm. But at the time, we were able to organize the entire region in order to prevail, if you will. There was a great coalition put together. We had a $60 billion war that cost us $5 billion because others chipped in. It was a unique moment when you pull all of that together, and when the U.S. was clearly preeminent in the region. Since then, over time, obviously, there have been the rise of ISIS, the development of efforts to establish a caliphate, which they've successfully done now in Syria and Iraq. We've seen efforts by the Iranians to dominate. They now are sort of preeminent, if you will, in Beirut, in Damascus, in Yemen. The IRGC has been very, very active over the years. The Iranians have been very active over the years, pursuing the title they bear as the world's worst state sponsor of terror. And all of that's been going on now for a long time before we got involved.
So one argument I often have with people in Washington is about whether the Iraq War was a triggering factor. There's a suggestion that a lot of people like to make, and it's not really a partisan suggestion, more of an ideological one, that getting rid of Saddam Hussein just sort of ripped the lid off the Middle East, and it was from thence that everything began to topple regimes, the Arab Spring. What do you say to that?
Well, I say you've got to look back at history. We had a very serious nuclear proliferation problem in the Middle East that goes back to 1981, long before we did anything vis-a-vis Saddam Hussein. But in 81, he had a nuclear program at the Osirik reactor outside Baghdad. The Israelis took it out. When I was Secretary of Defense in the summer of 90, I was visited by my Israeli counterpart, the Defense Minister, Misha Aarons, and the senior uniformed officer, Ehud Barak, and they showed me evidence that Saddam had started up in 1990, a nuclear program again, and then it was pretty far along. In Desert Storm, we went in, we took out that program. The IAEA went in afterwards and did an investigation and found out that he was much closer than we thought to actually having nuclear capability. This was an independent, international atomic energy agency that went in and checked that. That's not something the United States came up with, and that was before we ever got into the WMD debate with respect to when we went in 2003. It's a long history of Saddam Hussein trying to develop weapons of mass destruction. The first intelligence report I saw after I got elected vice president in 2000 warned about Iraq and WMD. So the activities of Saddam Hussein overwhelmingly created ferment and turmoil and raised the specter, especially of a link between terror on the one hand and weapons of mass destruction on the other. He used chemical weapons against thousands of his own people at Al Abja in 1988. I mean, he had a well-established track record that he was a troublemaker, and he had invaded Kuwait before, and we did go in with the support of a lot of Democrats, and in 2003, and we achieved our objective in that we got rid of Saddam Hussein. That also precipitated other activities. We found out, for example, that Muammar Gaddafi had a nuclear program, and 5 days after we captured Saddam Hussein, he surrendered all of his nuclear materials to us, his centrifuges, uranium feedstock, weapons design. So the circumstances over there in terms of the problems and the difficulties that we're developing pointed in the direction of what was my biggest fear, which was the possibility that terrorists would ultimately acquire something far deadlier than airline tickets and box cutters and require a nuclear weapon or chemicals or a biological agent. I was quoted in an interview I did about 5 months before 9/11 that was our biggest threat, and I think it still is today. And we've still got a very serious nuclear proliferation problem now that goes back